Continuing Marcus Brutus from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Then Macedonium was put into his hands and delivered up by Hortensius the praetor, and all the kings and potentates round about came and offered their services. So when news was brought that Caius, the brother of Antenna, having passed over from Italy, was marching on directly to join the forces that Vatinius commanded in Dyrrhachium and Apollonia, Brutus resolved to anticipate him and to seize them first, and in all haste move forwards with those that he had about him. His march was very difficult, through rugged places and in a great snow, but so swift that he left those that were to bring his provisions for the morning meal a great way behind. And now, being very near to Dyrrhachium with fatigue and cold, he fell into the distemper called bulimia. This is a disease that seizes both men and cattle after much labor, and especially in a great snow. Whether it is caused by the natural heat, when the body is seized with cold, being forced all inwards, and consuming at once all the nourishment laid in, or whether the sharp and subtle vapor which comes from snow as it dissolves cuts the body, as it were, and destroys the heat which issues from the pores, for the sweatings seem to arise from the heat meeting with the cold, and being quenched by it on the surface of the body. But this I have in another place discussed more at large. Well, people got to work out the possibilities of things sometimes. So obviously a lot of the thoughts that people had and still have about stuff, about diseases and stuff, are not always accurate. Brutus, growing very faint, and there being none in the whole army that had anything for him to eat, his servants were forced to have recourse to the enemy, and going as far as to the gates of the city, begged bread of the sentinels that were upon duty. As soon as they heard of the condition of Brutus, they came themselves and brought both meat and drink along with them, in return for which Brutus, when he took the city, showed the greatest kindness, not to them only, but to all the inhabitants for their sakes. Caius Antonius, in the meantime, coming to Apollonia, summoned all the soldiers that were near that city to join him there. But, finding that they, nevertheless, went all to Brutus, suspecting that even those of Apollonia were inclined to the same party, he quitted that city and came to Bothrotum, having first lost 3 cohorts of his men, that in their march thither were cut to pieces by Brutus. After this, attempting to make himself master of some strong places about Balice, which the enemy had first seized, he was overcome in a set battle by young Cicero, to whom Brutus gave the command, and whose conduct he made use of often, and with much success. Caius himself was surprised in a marshy place, at a distance from his support, and Brutus, having him in his power, would not suffer his soldiers to attack, but maneuvering about the enemy with his horse, gave command that none of them should be killed, for that in a little time they would all be of his side, which accordingly came to pass, for they surrendered both themselves and their general, so that Brutus had by this time a very great and considerable army. He showed all marks of honor and esteem to Caius for a long time, and left him the use of the ensigns of his office, though, as some report, he had several letters from Rome, and particularly from Cicero, advising him to put him to death. But at last, perceiving that he began to corrupt his officers, and was trying to raise a mutiny amongst the soldiers, he put him aboard a ship, and kept him close prisoner. In the meantime, the soldiers that had been corrupted by Caius returned to Apollonia and sent word to Brutus, desiring him to come to them thither. He answered that this was not the custom of the Romans, but that it became those who had offended to come themselves to their general and beg forgiveness of their offenses, which they did, and accordingly received their pardon. As he was preparing to pass into Asia, tidings reached him of the alteration that had happened at Rome, where the young Caesar, assisted by the Senate in opposition to Antony, and having driven his competitor out of Italy, had begun himself to be very formidable, suing for the consulship contrary to law, and maintaining large bodies of troops, of which the Commonwealth had no matter of need. And then, perceiving that the Senate, dissatisfied with the proceedings, began to cast their eyes abroad upon Brutus, and decreed and confirmed the government of several provinces to him. He had taken the alarm, therefore dispatching messengers to Antony, he desired that there might be a reconciliation and a friendship between them. Then, drawing all his forces about the city, he made himself to be chosen consul, though he was but a boy, being scarce 20 years old, as he himself writes in his memoirs. At the first entry upon the consulship, he immediately ordered a judicial process to be issued out against Brutus and his accomplices for having murdered a principal man of the city, holding the highest magistracies of Rome without being heard or condemned, and appointed Lucius Chronicus to accuse Brutus, and Marcus Agrippa to accuse Cassius. None appearing to the accusation, the judges were forced to pass sentence and condemn them both. It is reported that when the crier from the tribunal, as the custom was, with a loud voice cried Brutus to appear, the people groaned audibly, and the noble citizens hung down their heads for grief. Publicus Silicius was seen to burst into tears, which was the cause that not long after he was put down in the list of those that were proscribed. After this, the three men, Caesar, Antony, and Lepidus, being perfectly reconciled, shared the provinces among themselves, and made up the catalogue of prescription wherein were set those that were designed for slaughter, amounting to 200 men, in which number Cicero was slain. The news being brought to Brutus in Macedonia, he was under a compulsion, and sent orders to Hortensius that he should kill Caius Antonius in revenge of the death of Cicero his friend, and Brutus his kinsman, who also was proscribed and slain. Upon this account it was that Antony, having afterwards taken Hortensius in the battle of Philippi, slew him upon his brother's tomb. But Brutus expresses himself as more ashamed for the cause of Cicero's death than grieved for the misfortune of it, and says he cannot help accusing his friends at Rome that they were slaves more through their own doing than that of those who now were their tyrants. They could be present and see, and yet suffer those things which, even to hear related, ought to them to have been insufferable. Having made his army, that was already very considerable, pass into Asia, he ordered a fleet to be prepared in Bithynia and about Cyzicus, but going himself through the country by land, he made it his business to settle and confirm all the cities, and gave audience to the princes of the parts through which he passed. And he sent orders unto Syria to Cassius to come to him, and leave his intended journey into Egypt, letting him understand that it was not to gain an empire for themselves, but to free their country, that they went thus wandering about, and had an army together, whose business it was to destroy the tyrants. That therefore, if they remembered and resolved to persevere in their first appearance, they ought not to be too far from Italy, but to make what haste they could thither, and endeavor to relieve their fellow citizens from oppression. Cassius obeyed his summons and returned, and Brutus went to meet him. And at Smyrna, they met which was the first time they had seen one another since they parted at the Piraeus in Athens, one for Syria and the other for Macedonia. They were both extremely joyful and had a great confidence of their success at the sight of the forces that each of them had got together, to say who had fled from Italy like the most despicable exiles, without money, without arms, without a ship, or a soldier, or a city to rely on, in a little time after had met together, so well furnished with shipping and money, and an army both of horse and foot, that they were in a condition to contend for the empire of Rome. Cassius was desirous to show no less respect and honor to Brutus than Brutus did to him. But Brutus still was beforehand with him, coming for the most part to him, both because he was the elder man and of a weaker constitution than himself. Men generally reckon Cassius a very expert soldier, but of a harsh and angry nature, and one that desired to command rather by fear than love. Well, fear and love can actually mix, but yeah. Though, on the other side, among his familiar acquaintance, he would easily give way to jesting and play the buffoon, but Brutus, for his virtue, was esteemed by the people, beloved by his friends, admired by the best men, and hated not by his enemies themselves. Because as we mentioned earlier, he had an ethic about him that wasn't all, oh well, I approve because he's on my side. It's like, well, no, that's good. May not be for me, but I understand. That's how his enemies thought of him. Because even if it was against them, it wasn't. Well, this guy's doing something wrong. For he was a man of singularly gentle nature, of a great spirit, insensible of the passions of anger or pleasure or covetousness, steady and inflexible to maintain his purpose for what he thought right and honest, and that which gained him the greatest affection and reputation was the entire faith in his intentions, for it had not ever been supposed that Pompey the Great himself, if he had overcome Caesar, would have submitted his power to the laws, instead of taking the management of the state upon himself, soothing the people with the specious name of consul or dictator, or some other milder title than king. And they were well persuaded that Cassius, being a man governed by anger and passion, and carried often for his interest's sake beyond the bounds of justice, endured all those hardships of war and travel and danger, most assuredly to obtain dominion to himself, and not liberty to the people. And as for the former disturbers of peace in Rome, whether a Cinna, a Marius, or a Carbo, it is manifest that they, having set their country as a stake for him that should win, did almost own in express terms that they fought for empire. But even the enemies of Brutus did not, they tell us, by this accusation to his charge. Nay, many heard Antony himself say that Brutus was the only man that conspired against Caesar out of the sense of the glory and apparent justice of the action, but that all the rest rose up against the man himself from private envy and malice of their own. And it is plain by what he writes himself that Brutus did not so much rely upon his forces as upon his own virtue, for thus he speaks in a letter to Atticus shortly before he was to engage with the enemy, that his affairs were in the best state of fortune that he could wish, for that either he should overcome and restore liberty to the people of Rome, or die and be himself out of the reach of slavery. The other things being certain and beyond all hazard, one thing was yet in doubt, whether they should live or die free men, He adds further that Mark Antony had received a just punishment for his folly, who, when he might have been numbered with Brutus and Cassius and Cato, would join himself to Octavius, that though they should not now be both overcome, they soon would fight between themselves, and in this he seems to have been no ill prophet. Now when they were at Smyrna, Brutus desired of Cassius that he might have part of the great treasure that he had heaped up, because of all his own was expended in furnishing out such a fleet of ships as was sufficient to keep the whole interior sea in their power. But Cassius Cassius's friends dissuaded him from this, for, said they, it is not just that the money which you with so much parsimony keep, and with so much envy have got, should be given to him to be disposed of in making himself popular or gaining favor of the soldiers. Notwithstanding this, Cassius gave him a third part of all that he had, and then they parted, each to their several commands. Cassius, having taken Rhodes, behaved himself there with no clemency, though at his first entry, when some had called him lord and king, he answered that he was neither king nor lord, but the destroyer and punisher of a king and lord. Brutus, on the other part, sent to the Lucians to demand from them a supply of money and men, but Laucrates, their popular leader, persuaded the cities to resist, and they occupied several little mountains and hills with a design to hinder Brutus's passage. Brutus at first sent out a party of horse, which, surprising them as they were eating, killed 600 of them, and afterwards, having taken all their small towns and villages round about, he set all his prisoners free without ransom, hoping to win the whole nation by good will. But they continued obstinate, taking in anger what they had suffered, and despising his goodness and humanity, until, having forced the most warlike of them into the city of Xanthus, he besieged them there. They endeavored to make their escape by swimming and diving through the river that flows by the town, but were taken by nets and let down for that purpose, and the channel, which had little bells at the top, which gave present notice of any that were taken in them. After that they made a sally in the night, and seizing several of the battering engines, set them on fire, but being perceived by the Romans, were beaten back to their walls, and there being a strong wind, it carried the flames to the battlements of the city with such fierceness that several of the adjoining houses took fire. Brutus, fearing lest the whole city should be destroyed, commanded his own soldiers to assist and quench the fire. But the Lucians were on a sudden possessed with a strange and incredible desperation, such a frenzy as cannot be better expressed than by calling it a violent appetite to die. For both women and children, the bondmen and the free, those of all ages and all conditions, strove to force away the soldiers that came in to their assistance from the walls, and themselves, gathering together reeds and wood, and whatever combustible matter they found, spread the fire over the whole city, feeding it with whatever fuel they could, and by all possible means exciting its fury, so that the flame, having dispersed itself and encircled the whole city, blazed out in so terrible a manner that Brutus, extremely afflicted at their calamity, got on horseback and rode round the walls, earnestly desirous to preserve the city, and stretching forth his hands to the Xanthians, begged of them that they would spare themselves and save the town. Yet none regarded his entreaties, but by all manner of ways strove to destroy themselves, not only men and women, but even boys and little children. With a hideous outcry leaped some into the fire, others from the walls, others fell upon their parents' swords, baring their throats and desiring to be struck. After the destruction of the city, there was found a woman who had hanged herself with her young child hanging from her neck, and the torch in her hand with which she had fired her own house. Imagine if you have to repeat suicides in hell about this stuff, but if you're murdered and you're provoking your own murder, and you know what I mean, like that sort of thing, you're responsible for the murder. Just because you don't physically do a crime, the thing you're promoting, you get credit for. Now there's fighting for your defense, and they have to fight. They're fighting for their own defense. That's different. But it was so tragical a sight that Brutus could not endure to see it, but wept at the very relation of it, and proclaimed a reward to any soldier that could save a Xanthian. And it is said that 150 only were found, to have their lives saved against their wills. Thus, the Xanthians, after a long space of years, the fated period of their destruction having, as it were, run its course, repeated by their desperate deed the former calamity of their forefathers, who, after the very same manner in the Persian War, had fired their city and destroyed themselves. Brutus, after this, finding that the Patarians resolved to make resistance and hold out their city against him, was very unwilling to besiege it, and was in great perplexity lest some frenzy might seize them too. But having in his power some of their women, who were his prisoners, he dismissed them all without any ransom, who, returning and giving an account to their husbands and fathers, who were of the greatest rank, what an excellent man Brutus was, how temperate and how just, persuaded them to yield themselves and put their city into his hands. From this time all the cities round about came into his power, submitting themselves to him, and found him good and merciful, even beyond their hopes. For though Cassius at the same time had compelled the Rhodians to bring in all the silver and gold that each of them privately was possessed of, by which he raised a sum of 8,000 talents, and besides this had condemned the public to pay the sum of 500 talents more, Brutus, not having taken above 150 talents from the Lycians, and having done them no other manner of injury, parted from thence with his army to go into Ionia. Through the whole course of this expedition, Brutus did many memorable acts of justice, in dispensing rewards and punishments to such as had deserved either. But one particular I will relate, because he himself and all the noblest Romans were gratified with it above all the rest. When Pompey the Great, being overthrown from his great power by Caesar, had fled to Egypt and landed near Pelusium, the protectors of the young king consulted among themselves what was fit to be done on that occasion. Nor could they all agree in the same opinion, some being for receiving him, others for driving him from Egypt. But Theodotus, a Chian by birth, and then attending upon the king as a paid teacher of rhetoric, and for want of better men admitted into the council, undertook to prove to them that both parties were in the wrong, those that counseled to receive Pompey, and those that advised to send him away. And in their present case, one thing only was truly expedient, to seize him and to kill him, and ended his argument with the proverb that dead men don't bite. The council agreed to his opinion, and Pompey the Great, an example of incredible and unforeseen events, was slain, as the sophister himself had the impudence to boast. Through the rhetoric and cleverness of Theodotus, not long after, when Caesar came to Egypt, some of the murderers received their just reward and suffered the evil death they deserved. But Theodotus, though he had borrowed on from fortune a little further time for a poor, despicable, and wandering life, yet did not lie hid from Brutus as he passed through Asia, but being seized by him and executed, had his death made more memorable than was his life. And one of the things very important to regard is the just because there's been a trial, particularly when the elites decide this person needs a trial, when the elites decide someone needs a trial, even a trial doesn't mean that they were guilty. About this time, Brutus sent to Cassius to come to him at the city of Sardis, and when he was on his journey, went forth with his friends to meet him, and the whole army in array saluted each of them with the name of Imperator. Now, as it usually happens in business of great concern, and where many friends and many commanders are engaged, several jealousies of each other, and matters of private accusation having passed between Brutus and Cassius, they resolved before they entered upon any other business immediately to withdraw into some apartment, where the door being shut, and they two alone, they being first to expostulate, and then to dispute hotly, and accuse each other, and finally were so transported into passion as to fall to hard words, and at last burst out into tears. Their friends, who stood without, were amazed, hearing them loud and angry, and feared lest some mischief might follow, but yet durst not interrupt them, being commanded not to enter the room. However, Marcus Favonius, who had been an ardent admirer of Cato, and not so much by his learning or wisdom as by his wild, vehement manner, maintained the character of a philosopher, was rushing in upon them, but was hindered by the attendants. But it was a hard matter to stop Favonius, wherever his wildness hurried him, for he was fierce in all his behavior, and ready to do anything to get his will. And though he was a senator, yet thinking that one of the least of his excellences, he valued himself more upon a sort of cynical liberty of speaking what he pleased, which sometimes indeed did away with the rudeness and unseasonableness of his addresses with those that would interpret it in jest. Thus, this Favonius, breaking by force through those that kept the doors, entered into the chamber, and with a set voice declaimed the verses that Homer makes Nestor use. Be ruled, for I am older than ye both. At this Cassius laughed, but Brutus thrust him out, calling him impudent dog and counterfeit cynic. But yet for the present they let it put an end to their dispute, and parted. Cassius made a supper that night, and Brutus invited the guests, and when they were set down, Favonius, having bathed, came in among them. Brutus called out and told him he was not invited, and bade him go to the upper couch. But he violently thrust himself in, and lay down on the middle one, and the entertainment passed in sportive talk, not wanting either wit or philosophy. The next day after, upon the accusation of the Sardians, Brutus publicly disgraced and condemned Lucius Pella, one that had been under censor of Rome, and employed in offices of trust by himself, for having embezzled the public money. This action did not a little vex Cassius, for but a few days before, two of his own friends being accused of the same crime, he only admonished them in private, but in public absolved them, and continued them in his service. And upon this occasion he accused Brutus of too much rigor and severity of justice, at a time which required them to use more policy in favor. But Brutus bade him remember the Ides of March, and the day when they killed Caesar, who himself neither plundered nor pillaged mankind, but was only the support and strength of those that did, and bade him consider that if there was any color for justice to be neglected, it had been better to suffer the injustice of Caesar's friends than to give impunity to their own. For then, said he, we would have been accused of cowardice only, whereas now we are liable the accusation of injustice, after all our pain and dangers which we endure, by which we may perceive what was Brutus's purpose and the rule of his actions, about the time that they were going to pass out of Asia into Europe, it is said that a wonderful sign was seen by Brutus. He was naturally given to much watching, and by practice and moderation in his diet had reduced his allowance of sleep to a very small amount of time. He never slept in the daytime, and in the night then only when all his business was finished, and when everyone else was being gone to rest. He had nobody to discourse with him, but at this time, the war being begun, having the whole state of it to consider, and being solicitous of the event, after his first sleep, which he let himself take after his supper, he spent all the rest of the night in settling his most urgent affairs, which, if he could dispatch early and so make a saving of any leisure, he employed himself in reading until the third watch, at which time the centurions and tribunes were used to come to him for orders. Thus, one night before he passed out of Asia, did it mean Asia or Asia? Because Asia is not as big as Asia, but he was very late, all alone in his tent, with a dim light burning by him, all the rest of the camp being hushed and silent, and reasoning about something with himself, and very thoughtful. He fancied someone came in, and looking up toward the door, he saw a terrible and strange appearance of an unnatural and frightful body standing by him without speaking. Brutus boldly asked it, "What are you, of men or gods? Is it demons or deities?" What is he saying? "And upon what business come to me?" The figure answered, "I am your evil genius, Brutus. You shall see me at Philippi." To which Brutus, not at all disturbed, replied, "Then I shall see you." Well, what, he accepted his evil side? And so the evil entity promoting that was, maybe there's some translation issue, but as soon as that apparition vanished, he called his servants to him, who all told him that he had neither heard that they had neither heard any voice nor seen any vision. So then he continued watching till the morning, when he went to Cassius and told him of what he had seen. He, who followed the principles of Epicurus's philosophy, and often used to dispute with Brutus concerning matters of this nature, spoke to him thus upon this occasion: "It is the opinion of our sect, Brutus, that not all that we feel or see is real and true, but that the sense is a most slippery and deceitful thing, and the mind yet more quick and subtle to put the sense in motion and affect it with every kind of change upon no real occasion of fact, just as an impression is made upon wax, and the soul of man, which has in itself both what imprints and what is imprinted on, may most easily by its own operations produce and assume every variety of shape and figure. This is evident from the sudden changes of our dreams, in which the imaginative principle, once started by any trifling matter, goes through a whole series of most diverse emotions and appearances. It is its nature to be ever in motion, and its motion is fantasy, our conception. But besides all this, in your case, the body, being tired and distressed with continual toil, naturally works upon the mind and keeps it in an excited and unusual condition. But that there should be anything such as supernatural beings, or if there were, that they should have human shape or voice or power that can reach to us, there is no reason for believing." Well, no, but if you say that they're not limited to that, though I confess I could wish that there were such beings, and that we might not rely upon our arms only, and our horses, and our navy, all which are so numerous and powerful, but might be confident of the assistance of, what are called gods also, in this, our most sacred and honorable attempt. Now, no, well, okay, that's not the way to phrase it, but, it's not that they they can assist you even though they're not physical.